The Naval Academy operated like clockwork, precision ingrained into every movement of the cadets. Morning drills were in full swing, the rhythmic sound of synchronized footsteps echoing across the parade ground. Officers observed in silence, their sharp eyes scanning for the slightest imperfection. Cadet formations were impeccable, discipline unwavering. Then, without warning, a black motorcade rolled past the gates. The vehicles came to a smooth stop near the main courtyard, their polished exteriors reflecting the early sunlight. The rigid structure of the academy cracked for the first time that morning. Cadets stealing quick glances, officers exchanging uncertain looks. The doors opened, and out stepped Donald Trump. A hush fell over the grounds. His presence wasn't on the schedule. The commanding officer, momentarily frozen, quickly straightened his posture before moving forward with a crisp salute. "Mr. President, we weren't expecting—" Trump cut him off with a nod. "Good. I'm not here for a tour." His voice was steady, carrying easily over the open space. He turned his gaze to the assembled cadets, scanning their faces, reading their expressions. "I want to speak to your future leaders." The officers hesitated. This wasn't how visits worked. There were procedures, formalities. But Trump wasn't following the script. He gestured toward the cadets. "Gather them." Informally, the tension thickened as the officers scrambled to comply. The cadets, still standing at attention, exchanged puzzled looks. There was no speech, no grand announcement, just a direct request that no one had anticipated. The morning's routine had been shattered, replaced by something unpredictable. Trump folded his hands behind his back, glancing at the officers. "Let's see what they're really made of." The cadets assembled in a loose semicircle, their rigid formation now replaced with a more informal stance. Some stood at attention out of habit, others shifted uneasily, unsure of what was expected. Trump paced slowly in front of them, his gaze sharp, reading them the way a seasoned commander might evaluate his troops. The atmosphere felt charged, part curiosity, part tension. Some cadets exuded confidence, answering his questions with ease, speaking about duty, honor, and a lifelong desire to serve. Others were more hesitant, their responses clipped, as if unsure of their own words. Trump's eyes lingered on one cadet near the back, a young man who hadn't spoken at all. His shoulders were squared, his posture disciplined, but there was something guarded about his expression. The name on his uniform read Ortega. Trump studied him for a moment before pointing. "You," he said. "Why did you join?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed Ortega's face. He straightened, clearly weighing his words before speaking. "Sir, to serve my country." Trump tilted his head, unimpressed. "I've heard that answer a dozen times today. Why did you join?" The cadet hesitated. The other cadets turned slightly, sensing the shift. Silence stretched for a beat too long. Trump folded his arms. "I'll ask again. Why are you here?" James Ortega exhaled, his composure slipping just a fraction. "Because I had to be." Trump's eyes narrowed. "Explain." Ortega clenched his jaw. Then, as if something inside him cracked, he spoke. "My father was Navy. He wanted this, for me more than anything. But he died last year." His voice tightened. "I didn't want to disappoint him." Trump nodded, but didn't look away. "And now?" James hesitated, glancing at the other cadets, as if debating whether to say what was truly on his mind. "Now I don't know if I can stay." His voice was lower this time, almost reluctant. "Sir, I'm top of my class in academics. My instructors say I have what it takes, but my family back home is struggling. My mother works 2 jobs, and I send what I can from my stipend. Even with financial aid, it's not enough. I might have to drop out." A weighted silence settled over the group. Some of the cadets shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at Ortega with quiet respect. Trump's expression didn't change, but his posture did. He stood a little straighter, as if filing this moment away. Then he nodded once. "That," he said, "is something worth talking about." The group remained silent as Trump held Ortega's gaze. The weight of the young cadet's words lingered, heavier than the crisp morning air. Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned to one of the officers standing nearby. "Get me a room," he said simply. The officer hesitated, glancing at the commanding officer for approval before nodding. Within minutes, Trump and Ortega were seated in a small, unadorned office, the walls lined with academy plaques and framed photographs of past graduates. Ortega sat stiffly, his hands clasped together, unsure of what to expect. Trump leaned back in his chair, studying him. "Tell me everything," he said. Ortega swallowed. "Sir," Trump gestured, "not just about you. I want to know how many others are in your situation. How many cadets are struggling to stay here, not because they aren't good enough, but because of things they can't control." Ortega hesitated. He hadn't expected this. He had imagined being dismissed with polite words, maybe some encouragement to push through. But this was different. He exhaled slowly, his composure shifting from rigid discipline to something more honest. "A lot," he admitted. "More than people realize. Some come from military families who can barely afford to support them. Some send money home like I do. Others, they're just barely holding on." He shook his head. "We don't talk about it. We're trained to handle pressure, to push through. But that doesn't make it easier." Trump nodded slowly. He'd seen this before. Young men and women, full of potential, crushed under burdens no one else noticed. "You ever tell anyone this?" Ortega let out a short laugh, humorless. "Who would listen?" Trump didn't respond right away. He glanced toward the door as if considering something. Then he leaned forward. "I'm listening." The words hung in the air. Ortega didn't know what to say. He had spent months wrestling with the idea of leaving, convincing himself that no one would care, that his struggles were his alone. But here was the President of the United States, giving him his full attention. No cameras, no reporters, just a man who, for reasons Ortega couldn't yet understand, wanted to help. Trump tapped his fingers against the desk, deep in thought. Then, without hesitation, he spoke. "We're going to fix this." Ortega blinked. "Sir?" Trump stood, pulling out his phone. "I'm creating a scholarship program. Right now." Ortega's mind raced. "Sir, with all due respect, you can't just..." Trump raised a hand. "Watch me." A few quick calls. Short, sharp instructions. The kind of commands that didn't leave room for argument. Within minutes, things were in motion. Trump turned back to Ortega. No cadet should have to choose between serving their country and taking care of their family. That ends today. Ortega sat there, stunned. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders felt lighter. James Ortega still couldn't wrap his head around what had just happened. Less than an hour ago, he had been another struggling cadet, silently debating whether he should walk away from everything he had worked for. Now he sat in stunned silence as Trump finished another phone call, setting the foundation for a scholarship program that hadn't existed that morning. The president had spoken about it as if it were inevitable, as if fixing a problem that had been ignored for years was just another task to cross off his list. Ortega had never seen anything like it. Trump stood and checked his watch. "You ever given a speech before?" Ortega frowned, caught off guard. "A few, sir." "Good," Trump said. "Because you're about to give one now." Before Ortega could question him, Trump was already moving, stepping out of the office, and striding back toward the courtyard. Word had spread fast. Cadets had gathered, whispering among themselves, the energy different from before. Officers stood near the front, their expressions unreadable. Trump stepped to the center, motioning for Ortega to follow. "I asked for leaders," Trump said, his voice carrying through the open space. "And I found one." He gestured toward Ortega, whose stomach tightened as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. "This young man and many others like him are fighting battles most of us don't see. And yet they're still here, still standing, still pushing forward." Trump let the words sink in before continuing. This academy isn't just about training the best. It's about honoring those who came before us and ensuring their sacrifices meant something. That's why I've asked Cadet Ortega to lead today's tribute to those who paved the way. Ortega's throat went dry. He hadn't prepared for this. But as Trump stepped back, giving him the floor, he knew there was no turning away. He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "We trained to be the best," Ortega began, his voice steady despite the weight of the moment. "We push through exhaustion, through pain, through doubt. But we don't do it alone. We stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, the men and women who gave everything so that we could be here today." He turned slightly, glancing at the Academy's memorial wall, where the names of fallen alumni were etched into history. Some of us come from families who served. Some of us are the first in our families to walk this path. But no matter where we come from, we carry the same responsibility: to honor their legacy, to be worthy of the uniform, and to never forget why we chose this. Silence settled over the courtyard, heavier than before. Ortega swallowed, his voice lower now. And sometimes we forget that even the strongest among us need help. We carry burdens we don't talk about. But today, for the first time, someone listened. He turned back to Trump. "You listened?" Trump gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "So today," Ortega continued, "we don't just honor the ones who came before us. We honor each other. Because the only way we make it through is together." The cadets stood taller. The officers exchanged glances. And in that moment, Ortega knew something had changed. The academy was different now. The tension that once weighed on cadets struggling in silence had lifted, replaced by a quiet confidence. The scholarship program had done more than relieve financial burdens. It had ignited something in them, a renewed sense of purpose. No one felt like they were fighting alone anymore. They pushed harder, trained smarter, knowing that for the first time, someone had seen their struggles and refused to let them be ignored. The impact rippled through every corner of the academy, and nowhere was it more evident than in James Ortega. He had thrown himself into his training with a relentless determination, no longer burdened by uncertainty. His name climbed to the top of every leaderboard, his performance setting new standards. The cadets who once shared his doubts now looked to him as an example, not just of skill, but of resilience. He had been given an opportunity, and he had refused to waste it. Months passed, and when graduation day arrived, his name was called last, but it carried the most weight. He stepped onto the stage in full dress uniform, the honor of valedictorian now his. The crowd of cadets, officers, and families sat in respectful silence as he approached the podium. He had rehearsed his speech countless times, but as he stood before them, he realized the words didn't need to be memorized. They had already been written in the months that followed that one unexpected visit. He looked out at his fellow graduates, the ones who had pushed through alongside him, then at the man seated in the front row. Trump met his gaze, a slight nod of recognition. Ortega spoke with conviction. He spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of the unbreakable bond that held them together. He spoke of the fallen, of the ones who had made this moment possible. And then, in the final moments, he spoke of the man who had changed everything. "You showed up when no one expected you to. You listened when no one else would. And you gave us something more than a scholarship. You gave us belief." Applause filled the hall, but it wasn't for him alone. It was for the moment, the change, the new legacy being written. When the ceremony ended, the graduates lined up for their final handshake, the moment that marked the beginning of their next chapter. Ortega stepped forward, and Trump extended his hand. As they clasped wrists in a firm grip, Trump leaned in slightly, his voice low but certain. "I knew you had it in you." Ortega didn't need to say anything. He just nodded, his grip tightening for a second before he stepped away, joining his fellow officers as they walked forward into the future they had all fought to claim. Please click on one of the videos on your screen to watch another story celebrating the human spirit. If you enjoy meaningful stories, please subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss out on our latest uploads. Thanks for being a part of Unbroken Stories.